Good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Welcome to another edition of the Scott Ritter Show. What a week it's been. We witnessed last month and early this month stunning successes on the part of the Ukrainian military on the battlefield. Russian military in retreat. Russia seeking to rapidly mobilize 300,000 men in an effort to stabilize the battlefield. Things weren't looking good for Russia. And then the Ukrainians decided to attack the Crimea bridge. Suddenly, Russia has a new commander, General Surovkin. General Armageddon is his nickname, an ominous name. And then we are witness to multiple days of concerted aerial assault on targets in Ukraine, energy-related targets that many observers, myself included, had been saying should have been struck from the very beginning. These were targets that, if Russia was serious about defeating Ukraine, defeating the Ukrainian military, they should have struck these early on to paralyze Ukraine, to make it difficult for Ukraine to move troops to and fro, make it difficult for the leadership of Ukraine to get on the internet and beg for money and equipment from NATO. But it's happening right now, a new phase in the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But is it a new phase? I mean, we have a new general, we have a new attitude, it seems, we have new targets. But has anything changed on the battlefield? Is anything going to change on the battlefield? These are great questions. Is Russia setting itself up for yet another failure, another letdown? And is this string of Russian disappointments playing into the hands of NATO and Ukraine? You know, in the aftermath of the missile attacks on Ukraine, on Kiev, Lvov, other targets, we have NATO now meeting to provide brand new integrated air defense systems to Ukraine, air defense systems that maybe should have been provided earlier from the NATO perspective, but now are going to be coming in designed to defeat this new Russian tactic of long-range bombardment. We have the Ukrainian government speaking of the need to continue pressing the Russians to highlight the failures of the Russian military, the inefficiencies of the Russian government, the incompetence of Russia as a whole, in an effort to achieve what they would call a Moscow Maidan, seeking to replicate in Russia what occurred in February of 2014, a coup d'etat, a popular uprising, whatever you want to call it, that would throw out the government of President Vladimir Putin and replace him with something that was more aligned with the West. This appears to be the Ukrainian strategy. The question is Russia playing into their hands? Or does Russia mean it this time? Is Russia going to finally win this war? I'm joined today by a veteran Russian political commentator named Dmitry Kulikov, and I don't think there's anybody better to discuss these issues with than him. Thank you very much for joining me. So I'm going to ask you straight off, is Russia going to win this war?
Undoubtedly, we don't have any doubts that Russia will win this war. You've said that you witness how, as an analysis, a little bit different stage, and the change of methods in conducting war. I remember you were very surprised at the very beginning of the military operation, and you said why Russia conducted war not like the Americans did. If we look at the history of Yugoslavia conflict, and it could be seen in the American interventions in Iraq, when several dozens of days, 50 days, there was a total destruction of energy infrastructure, engineering infrastructure, and the transportation network, and only after all these facilities are destroyed, like in Iraq, America just gets down to the ground military operation, and it was very surprised at the very beginning by the measures taken by Russia that we didn't act like that. So why did it happen so? Mostly due to the fact that we treat people living in this area, and this is the area of a former Ukrainian Socialistic Republic in USSR, which was former USSR, and that was the Russian Empire before. We really look and view most of the people living in this area as ourselves. That's a part of our people. We do understand that Ukraine, since 2014 to be precise, has been under the occupation of the US. There is no Ukrainian strategy, there is no Ukrainian government, there is no Ukrainian president. You can use different words, puppy, avatar. As I understand, the US considers that has made a bargain. It's a big success of America. Just using several tens of billions of dollars, which is just a ridiculous sum for the US, within the process of issuing trillions of US dollars, and the overall sovereign debt, 31 trillion US dollars. 60 or 70 billion is almost nothing. But for 60, 70 billion, you can hire 1 million army and hire almost half of the country. For this half of the country and the army go to death with one goal: to have maximum damage and collateral damage to Russia. And America views that as a great deal, as a bargain. It's great for them. So the difficulty faced by Russia is that we do understand that our enemy, our adversary, is not Ukraine. That's the hired American army and the hired American socium, which is under total governance of the US. It causes some difficulties. So we do have a task in front of us to liberate the biggest part of the population of Ukraine, to liberate them from this American occupation, but not to destroy this population. And all the difficulties, all the controversies which you have witnessed over this period of time in your analytical inputs, analytical statements as a military analyst, you have always asked a question: so what is happening? So there is no logic behind the war measures. That's not how you conduct the war. You do it in a different way. I've listened to many of your statements and your analytics. From my perspective, it's mostly connected to the fact that we are conducting the war for liberation of a part of our people and for liberation of our land, which cannot be burned under the fire attack. It's our part of the land. We do not view them as the hostilities. We view them as our own people. Even we do not regard them as enemies. You might be surprised, but it's my personal point of view, but it is shared by many in Russia. Our adversary and enemy is the US. And what they initiated, what they instigated in Ukraine, they have a very useful tool as a dummy. You know, even Avatar movie fits into the, they just act through this avatar, and that is what many our difficulties are caused by. This is the first point. And the second point, I do believe that the way of conducting military operation is being changed, and it will change. We need to understand that Russia, over 6 months, has conducted through its expeditionary battalion, expeditionary army corps, the contract army of a peaceful time. If we compare the forces when we do not have burning action against total military and civil infrastructure in the Ukraine, conquering this area when you have 150,000 of troops against 500,000 when Ukraine conducted its mobilization before. So, and when you have just over 1,000 kilometers of front line, there's some difficulties. So you as a military person understand that much better than I do. Of course, so from my perspective, there has been a revision of how to conduct a military operation, and the consequence of that can be seen in the very near future. And there is a question. The question to you. How long will the US be able to maintain this very beneficial position when they conduct war through Ukraine against Russia, but we have nothing to do with that? We are not a part of the conflict. We do not do that. That's what they claim. Because the situation will change drastically from my perspective when, in the US, the people and the part of the establishment, of the American establishment, understands that Russia regards Ukraine, not Ukraine, but America as an enemy. And then there might be a situation when we're going to highlight that. That's kind of comparison with the Cuban crisis in English. It sounds like that. When two countries look into the eyes and they hold a pistol and a gun with a finger on the trigger point, and then when the real talk starts, I believe that the real solution to this crisis will be only possible when there is kind of a situation like that. So it hasn't happened yet.
Well, it's a very fair question, but I think the answer is quite clear. America will fight this conflict to the last Ukrainian. We're not going to lose any Americans in this fight. This isn't a fight that the United States is going to put people like me on the ground. You're not going to run up against American Marines, American soldiers, the American Air Force. That's not the conflict the United States is looking for. That's not the conflict that's been sold to the American people. So the United States will continue until the last Ukrainian. And this is a tragedy for Ukraine. This is a tragedy for Europe, because Europe's paying a horrific economic price for this American policy. It's a tragedy for Russia. I mean, if your heart doesn't bleed for every Russian mother, wife, daughter, son, uncle, aunt who has somebody on the front line, somebody who is fighting, somebody who's dying, somebody who's been wounded, then you're not human. And if your heart doesn't bleed for the Ukrainians who are in the same situation, you're not human. And unfortunately, we have an American government that appears to be not human, because there's no humanity whatsoever in the posture we've taken. This is purely a calculation that we will invest billions of dollars into propping up Ukraine so that they can fight as long as possible to hurt Russia as much as possible. So there's my answer. America will fight to the last Ukrainian. But here's my question back to you. How long will Russia put up with this? How long will Russia allow this to happen in this manner? Is Russia going to defeat Ukraine? Is Russia willing to fight to the last Ukrainian? Because that's what we're asking of you. It's not just that we're willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. We're putting Russia in a position that in order to prevail, Russia has to be willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And as you indicated, your relationship with Ukraine is not of the traditional enemy. Your relationship is of a family member who's been brought under bad guidance, and you're trying to bring that family member back into the family. Are you willing to kill?
The wrong family. This part of the family started to work for the wrong family, against your own family. I'd like to reiterate that our difficulty is that we do understand that America is fighting and conducting war till the very last Ukrainian. But we don't want to destroy Ukrainians, all of them. That's the only difficulty we face in conducting this particular military operation. All the time we're looking for the scenario which would allow us to solve some problem of Ukraine as an American avatar, not destroying a big part of the population without destroying the area, the industry, the infrastructure, and so on and so forth. That's a very difficult task. If we take this game imposed by the US and we destroy Ukraine, and the attacks of the last days demonstrate that we are able to do that without even using nuclear weapons. Without using these nuclear weapons, over a week we can paralyze the whole infrastructure of Ukraine. During winter time, at possible death to a big number of the population and many difficult situations for the part of the population, but we do not want to do that because we regard them as ourselves. That might sound bizarre and ridiculous to an American public, but in our mindset, it's quite clear how to find this possible solution. Destroy the American avatar without destroying the life of a big number of people in Ukraine. That's what we're doing right now. We're looking for this scenario, for this way out. And this is very important for us, since an alternative is quite clear. You can go through the whole Ukraine, destroy the whole area of Ukraine, but for us, it's not a positive case scenario.
Well, here's another question for you along the same line. I mean, what you've outlined makes perfect sense to me. And I'm sure to people listening, it will make sense. Is this a stance that's accepted by the Russian people, not the Russian government? We know that the Russian government has articulated a policy. The Russian people, and the reason why I ask is, here in the United States, we look at this conflict from the American perspective, where we want a rapid victory, and anything less than a rapid victory is deemed as a defeat, an embarrassment. And in America, when the government's embarrassed, there's sometimes political consequences for that. It appears that the strategy of the United States and the strategy of NATO and of the Ukrainian government is to embarrass Russia by its inability to win this war, thereby getting the Russian population angry enough to have a new Moscow Maidan moment. But this is a huge miscalculation on the part of the United States, Ukraine, and the West if the Russian people aren't going to be embarrassed, that the Russian people understand exactly what you have told me. Is your point of view shared by the majority of the Russian people?
I believe that it is shared by the majority of the Russian people. Most people support what the President Putin is doing and what the Russian state is doing. But we have learned a lot. This Mr. Borrell, who is, from my perspective, is a kind of puppy in a Biden group, and he doesn't make any statement on his behalf. It seems to me that he just reads out the texts written by the Biden's administration. But Mr. Borrell this week has said that we have deceived Russians. In the West, many interviewers of mine say that the Russian, when decided to conduct invasion of Ukraine and wanted to tackle this problem because the West had deceived the Russians, and Mr. Borrell says that it doesn't matter. We deceived them just back in the history, back in the past. Let's not pay attention to that anymore. What Russians started to do, it was not motivated by that. It is absolutely unreasonable. Yes, we did deceive, but let's forget about that. The Russian people will not deceive that, Scott, And what Russian people cannot understand, and particularly Mr. Borrell cannot understand, and many people in the US cannot understand, that the Russian people over the 30 years, it has been absolutely positive that at the end of 1980s, when we offered the US peace without conditions, just peace, by Mr. Gorbachev, we were deceived. We started to live by the rules of the world, but America continued its war against us. That happened in the 1980s, 1990s, and we were deceived. And we will not forget that. We will not forget that. Never. Therefore, the time of exchanging this deceit, it just hasn't started yet. But this time will come when we do the same. And the most of the Russian people do remember how in our open hands and the peace proposals, America in 1992 said that it had won us in the Cold War. And they just total defeat to those who were deceived, that there was a winner and there was a loser. And in the ancient Roma said just grievance to those defeated. Over these 30 years of time, we've learned what the grievance to those who were defeated is. So all the hope that the Russian people can be deceived another time is just unreasonable. It's just empty hope. We've lived through that. We've lived through this grand, big deceit against us. And we've learned a lot, at least, while these generations, which remember that time still alive, and it happened in 1980s, 1990s, nothing like that in Russia will be possible by the West.
You know, I was alive during that time, and I was alive during the 1980s. I'm sure you've seen my resume. I was an inspector in the Soviet Union implementing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I viewed that as sort of a Camelot moment, where two sides that could not get along with one another. We called you the evil empire. You called us enemy number one. And we were literally lined up face to face, as you said, with the guns pointed at each other, ready to go to war. And we found a way through that. We negotiated a treaty. There was mutual respect, and we were able to accomplish something that was not only historic, but meaningful, real peace with real potential. And then, as you said, we blew it. My question to you is, before this conflict started, before February 24th, on December 17th, Russia provided two draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States, which laid out Russia's concept and the need for a new European security framework. And at that time, NATO and the United States ignored Russia. Let's fast forward now. Russia wins the Ukrainian conflict in a manner that's acceptable to Russia. So it's clear Russian victory. NATO and the United States do not go to war with Russia. They accept the victory, but they're not happy. How do we get to that point where the treaties that Russia put on the table in December of 2021 can once again be discussed? Is Russia willing to work with the United States and NATO toward that objective, or have we missed this opportunity? And I bring that up because in 1985-86, we had very difficult relations between between the Soviet Union, the United States, and NATO. And yet somehow, in 1987, we were able to sign a treaty. Is there hope that somewhere down the future, that Russia, even though Russia won't allow itself to be deceived anymore, that Russia would be able to open up its heart and open up its mind and accept the need for a new Camelot moment, where once again, peace can be the common language between our two sides as opposed to conflict?
I believe that on the Russian part, there is no problem about that. But we will act for our interest to be guaranteed and secured. That's very important for us, and the whole experience of ours teaches us that. That's the first point. And the second problem is not about Russia, but the US. Since the system after 1991, after 1992, when the US claimed globally that they are the just master of the world, and this crown of the master of the world is still there, it's still on your head. And nothing prevented Mr. Biden from at least saying that he started negotiations with Mr. Putin on those proposals which Russia outlined in 2021, but Biden rejected even the idea of negotiations, not meeting the proposal outlined by Russia, but he just rejected any talk with Russia. As you understand, these are two different things. He didn't find it possible, since probably the master of the world cannot talk to anyone who should just be subject to this master of the world. The problem is about that. But the situation is changing very rapidly and drastically, and the world is changing very fast. Unlike the Soviet period, Russia today is not alone. That's what the USSR did, supporting anti-colonial movement in India, in China, in Africa, in the Middle East. In the USSR, it seemed didn't bear any reasons, but right now these are the biggest states, global states, which don't want to be colonies of the West World. They were liberated once, and right now they do understand that so-called global concept of the world, which is governed under the rules of the US, is a new form of colonial dependence. And they do not agree to that. And they realize that to stand against and not to become colony once again, only possible with Russia, since Russia has rebelled against being a colony like that. In the 90s, the West tried to make us another colony of the West. That's why Russia is not alone. And there will be no world with single master of the world. More than half of the humanity doesn't agree to having one master of the world. And the US cannot reject this idea, cannot give up this idea. The problem is that the way the so-called golden billion lives, led by the US, is only possible, the standard of living is only possible through getting riches of the world and exploiting the whole world. And to give up this idea means to change the standard of living. Neither US nor the West can start changing themselves. It has been great. I'd like to continue like that. They don't want any change. They want just continue the way of life they enjoyed before. So for them to be able to print money, $1.5 trillion every year, and causing no inflation. So just for everyone, for all the countries, sending and providing their resources and sending their labors using this money, because Russia should supply commodities through this printed money, and China shall sell cheap labor through this printed money, and that is going to be the foundation of a good life of the Western golden billion. First of all, the American people, and the Europeans will not have that enough, because Europe will start being exploited for the America to have very good standard of living for a period of time. And the Europeans don't realize that yet. Or maybe they are very happy to have goats and different livestock in the cities going to be frozen in the cities. There will be no jobs and so on and so forth. But for all the riches moving to the US, that's great. Europe probably likes that. But the world, which used to be colonies in the past, they don't like that. Neither China, India, Africa, even the Arab world. Look at that. Even the Arab world, in this OPEC Plus decision, said that they are going to decide on their own, and America will not impose their ideas. That was a direct statement by OPEC Plus. So the world is changing very fast and very drastically, and Russia is not alone at all.
У нас пауза какая-то. В смысле продолжить... Что случилось?
What has happened?
Вот, ну, поговорить как? Для эфира или просто поговорить? Или что? Для эфира. Вот, поэтому ситуация, которая была
the point. The situation which was described by a person who called himself the philosopher, by Mr. Fukuyama, that a new world is with us forever, which will not have any history, but is going to be a Western liberal democracy, and it will rule the world. It's over. This stage is over. So couldn't do that. The US is not able to be the master of the world anymore, and they will not be able to do that. You know, they feel this pain, they feel offended that they are fighting for that. That's possible. They're trying to keep their power. So when Scott asks a question whether the Russian people is ready to fight against it to the very end, yes, the Russian people is ready, since we do understand that in the world where the US will be the master of the world, there is no spot for us. We do know that. We'll be fighting till the very end, how difficult it is. You know, I can continue, but what is happening?
Восстановилась. Связь восстановилась.
Is connection all right?
Нет, по-моему, ничего не восстановилось. Да, окей.
All right.
Okay.
Right.
Nasi Livas, я не знаю. We made somebody angry, the CIA or the FSB.
Я не услышал перевода. Еще раз скажите, пожалуйста.
I can't hear the interpretation. Can you repeat, please?
No, it was a joke that we made somebody mad, either on my side or your side. They cut our internet.
We've made somebody angry and we were cut off the connection. Yeah, I got it. I got the joke.
Okay. Well, look here. I have a question. We have a little bit of time left, and again, I'm sorry for the disruption, but this is a question that came to me. When you talked about the United States not willing to give up its standard of living that's based upon a relationship with the world that's not sustainable, that brings to mind the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and in the decade of the 90s, Russia went through a horrible period of time, an unimaginable period of time. And yet, look at Russia today. I don't think many Americans understand what happened to Russia. And I think it would be very important if you would be able, because based upon the color of your hair, I think you and I were alive at the same time, and you know what happened in the 1990s. If you could maybe explain what it was like to live in Russia at that time, what it was like to go from the Soviet Union, this great power, to the new Russia where nothing worked, etc. Because I think when Americans look at Russia today, they don't understand where Russia came from. They only look at where Russia is. And I think it's important that we understand where you came from, what happened in the 1990s.
Scott, absolutely right. It is very important. I'm not sure whether I can explain that to the Americans, but I do understand a different thing. When the USSR collapsed, and President Putin called it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe because within the catastrophe there were lives of millions of people who didn't have jobs, who didn't have just common conveniences. There was no industry, there was a collapse of the state, huge level of crime rate and the different mobs, everything what we witnessed in the 90s in Russia. And I think, by the way, that the American strategy was the following. We were not supposed to cope with that. We were supposed to move along that path, going down the edge. We were supposed to self-destroy our country, and then it would be possible to come to our area, to put the right order. And the whole attempt of the war in Chechen Republic, in Chechnya, it was mostly orchestrated beyond the borders of Russia. There was a kind of prototype what should be around the whole area of Russia. And the second part of the concept was the following. Since Russia was very poor, everything that could be taken from Russia was taken in 1990s through different ways. By 2015, Russia was supposed to be unable to maintain its nuclear shield. And if these two trends had gone in line, the collapse of the state, the poverty, the rebellion in the lack of the nuclear weapons in Russia, then at the same time, we would have been taken by just empty hands, through the bare hands. But Russia took a different decision. It selected life but not death. And step by step, gradually, starting 2000, we started to build this new line of life, and we started to change ourselves. We started to live in a different way. And this path over 20 years has been taken. It has changed us a lot in our attitude to life, and we don't want to find ourselves on the edge of a big abyss, as we were in 1990s. We were at the edge of the abyss, and we looked at this abyss, and it lives in the memory of our people. It has a huge footprint. It is a big part of our memory. We have changed. To be honest, I have never visited the US. I have never visited the US personally, but in Europe, I have visited many countries in Europe. I have spent a lot of time in different European countries, different European cities, and I can tell you for sure that a number of Russian cities, if we are talking about Moscow, particularly, this is the best metropolis of the world. In Europe, there are no cities which can be compared with Moscow, for example, in the quality of life and how it is organized in Moscow. That's absolutely true. And I cannot say anything about the US. I can only see from the video the neighborhoods where people live on the pavements, those addicted to drugs. There is nothing like that in Russia, and we didn't even have that in 90s.
No, and look, you're 100% correct. I mean, I haven't been to Moscow in some time, so I can't. I'll take your word for it. Maybe in the future, I can see it myself. But the United States has significant problems, and this is the crux of the issue here. We have a government that makes policies based upon the advice of so-called experts who don't know Russia, don't know modern Russia, don't know the history of Russia, who are married to the Russia of the 1990s, where the United States had a master-slave relationship, and are uncomfortable with Russia becoming its own person, a man who stands in the room and says, I will be counted for who I am, not who you want me to be. And so the government makes policies and then sells these policies to the American people based upon fear. We're told to fear Russia. We're told to fear your leader. We're told to fear you. We're told to fear Mr. Solovyov. We're told to fear everybody in Russia. And that fear comes from ignorance. It comes from ignorance, because if you're knowledgeable, if you've empowered yourself with knowledge and information, you're no longer ignorant, and therefore you're not afraid of that which you don't understand. And that's why I find what we're doing here today to be extraordinarily valuable, because any American who watches this show will be getting a new insight, will be getting new information, will be able to empower his or herself with knowledge that does away with the fear, because they're no longer ignorant. And so I know we're on a time constraint. I really, really appreciated you coming on today. I really appreciate, I hope we can do it again in the future. This was a very, very valuable discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, again, Dmitry Kulikov, thank you very much for joining me. And I want to thank anybody who's watching this for joining as well. This is a process that will continue. This is a journey of exploration. This is a journey of enlightenment. And I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. My name's Scott Ritter. Thanks for coming.